The shadows beneath. Lena had always lived a quiet, ordinary life. Her days were simple: work at a small, quiet office, dinner with her elderly mother, and late-night TV. But every night, when she went to bed, there was something waiting for her. Something in the darkness beneath her bed. It wasn't always there, not at first. But as she got older, she began to notice a subtle presence lurking in the corner of her room, just out of her line of sight. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, or maybe the shadows playing tricks on her. But it was real. It was something that lived in the darkness. The presence wasn't malicious at first. It was simply there, moving in the corners of her vision, waiting for her to acknowledge it. When she did, it was almost like it would retreat, as if it didn't want to be seen. But the longer she ignored it, the stronger it became. One night, as Lena lay in bed, a sharp, cold breeze swept through her room. It wasn't from an open window. She had checked. The room was closed off, and the air was still. But the chill was unmistakable, creeping up her spine like fingers brushing against her skin. She turned toward the source of the coldness and froze. There, in the darkness beneath her bed, a pair of eyes gleamed back at her. The pupils were wide, black holes, swallowing all light, their gaze full of hunger. But it wasn't just the eyes that unnerved her. It was the shape, the outline of a creature, humanoid but distorted, twisted in ways that made her stomach churn. Its skin was pale, as if it had never seen the sun, and it shifted unnaturally, like it was made of shadows, not flesh. Lena couldn't scream. She couldn't move. Her body refused to obey, as though the creature had locked her in place with some unseen force. All she could do was stare into the hollow eyes, the only thing she could still see clearly. The creature didn't speak. It didn't need to. Lena could feel its thoughts in her mind, an overwhelming wave of hunger. But it wasn't for food. It wanted something more, something darker. As the days went by, the creature grew bolder. It would sit at the edge of her bed at night, watching her as she slept. When Lena would wake, it was always gone. But she could feel it still, its presence, lurking in the edges of her perception. The more she tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. And then, one day, it spoke. Lena was sitting at her desk, working late into the night, when she heard a voice in her ear. It wasn't loud. It was just a whisper, soft, almost kind. But the words were clear. Come closer. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned around, but the room was empty. She glanced down at the floor, half expecting to see the creature standing there, but nothing. Just the quiet of her apartment. At first, she thought it was a hallucination, maybe the exhaustion from the long hours at work. But that night, it came again. This time, the creature didn't wait until she was asleep. It waited until she was wide awake, lying in her bed, staring up at the ceiling. It whispered in her ear again, and then, so softly she almost didn't hear it, its cold, bony fingers brushed against her face. It wasn't a dream. It was real. And it wanted her to come closer. It wanted her to join it. Lena tried to run, but every time she attempted to leave, her legs would lock. She couldn't escape. She couldn't even scream. She was trapped in her own body, unable to break free from the creature's grip. The whispers became more insistent. They began to fill her mind, drowning out her thoughts, pushing her toward the shadows beneath the bed. She fought it, tried to scream, but her voice was silent. And then, one night, the creature made its final move. It crawled from beneath the bed, its long, spindly limbs stretching unnaturally, its face twisted into something resembling a smile. The hunger in its eyes was overwhelming. It wasn't just feeding, it was taking. Lena's mind shattered. The creature had been feeding on her fear, on her isolation, for months, slowly breaking down her will. And now, it was going to consume her completely. But there was one thing the creature didn't realize: Lena had learned how to fight back. She couldn't move her body, but she could still move her thoughts. She focused, reaching deep into the darkest corners of her mind. And there, buried beneath the surface, was the key, a memory, an image of her mother's face. A promise that had been made long ago. "You're not alone." It was enough to break the creature's hold. It screamed, a sound so high-pitched it rattled the windows. Lena forced herself to move, crawling toward the door, reaching for the light. But when she turned around, the creature was gone. For now. The next day, Lena packed her things and left. She didn't know where she would go, only that she could no longer stay there, in that house, where something darker than her fears lived. The creature beneath her bed may have been banished, but she knew better than to think it was truly gone. Because the darkness had a way of following you. And once it found you, it would never truly let you go. The lurking beneath. Emma had always been a restless soul. Her life in the small, quiet town of Carver's Hollow was mundane at best. She had her small house on the edge of the woods, a job as a part-time librarian, and a handful of friends who she kept at a distance. She preferred her solitude. Her days consisted of reading, walking through the woods, and avoiding the constant reminders of the town's strange history. Carver's Hollow was a place that hadn't seen much change over the years. Time had slowed here, people had come and gone, but nothing ever seemed to stick. The town was a graveyard of forgotten memories and untold stories, with secrets buried so deep that no one dared to disturb them. But Emma didn't care about secrets. She was more concerned with the voices in her head, the ones that whispered to her when the world around her grew quiet. Ever since she had moved into her house, there had been a nagging presence. A strange feeling that something, someone, was always watching her. It started small. At night, she would hear creaking, like the sound of footsteps walking just beneath the floorboards. At first, Emma assumed it was just the house settling. But after a few weeks, the sound started to feel intentional, rhythmic. Like someone, or something, was pacing back and forth beneath her. She tried to ignore it, dismissing it as the imagination of someone who had spent too much time alone. But then, one night, the whispers began. At first, it was just a faint murmur. A soft sound, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, or the distant hum of machinery. But as the days wore on, the whispers grew louder, clearer. She could almost make out the words, but they were always just out of reach. Always slipping away before she could understand them. One night, as the whispers reached a crescendo, Emma was sitting in her living room, reading a book, when she felt it. The unmistakable sensation of eyes on her. She looked up, scanning the empty room, but no one was there. Her heart raced as the feeling intensified, as if a shadow had crept into the corners of the room, watching her every move. The air grew thick, suffocating. It felt like something was closing in. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was heavy, oppressive. Emma felt like the walls themselves were pressing in on her. A cold draft swept through the room, despite the fact that all the windows were closed. The temperature dropped rapidly, and Emma shivered, clutching the edges of her blanket tighter. She looked around the room, heart pounding, and that's when she saw it. In the corner of the room, just beneath the staircase, there was a shadow. A dark, shapeless mass that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The shadow was moving, shifting, like it was trying to take form. She stood up, trembling. The shadow seemed to grow, stretching toward her. It wasn't natural. It shouldn't have been there. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The shadow slowly began to take shape, its edges becoming more defined, until Emma could make out a figure. A tall, thin figure, hunched and bent, its face hidden in the dark folds of its own shadow. It wasn't human. The figure stepped forward, and Emma felt her pulse quicken. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her body refused to obey. The figure's eyes gleamed in the darkness, wide and unblinking, black as the void. And then, it spoke. "Come closer." The voice was low, rasping, like 1,000 whispers had been compressed into a single sound. It echoed in Emma's mind, rattling her nerves. She wanted to run, to flee, but something was pulling her toward it. Some unseen force. It was as if the air around her had thickened, like she was swimming through molasses. "You are mine." Emma's legs finally moved, but it wasn't out of her own will. Her body moved toward the figure, as if it were being controlled by something else. The closer she got, the darker the figure became, its edges swirling like smoke. She could feel the coldness radiating from it, the same coldness that had swept through the room earlier. It was suffocating, like the air itself had turned to ice. As she reached out a trembling hand to touch the figure, she felt something brush against her skin, cold, unnatural fingers, like bones encased in ice. She recoiled, but her hand was frozen, her arm locked in place. The shadow's grip was tightening. "You will stay." Emma's vision blurred, and for a moment, she felt like she was being pulled into the shadow itself. She could hear whispers again, louder this time, more insistent. The whispers weren't just words, they were thoughts, alien thoughts, pressing into her mind like 1,000 needles. The last thing she heard before everything went dark was the sound of her own voice, but it wasn't hers. It was a hollow echo, repeating the same words over and over. "Come closer. Come closer." When Emma awoke, she was no longer in her living room. She was standing in the woods behind her house, the trees around her twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground was soft beneath her feet, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. It was as if the entire world had gone still, holding its breath. She didn't know how she had gotten here. One moment, she had been in her house, facing the figure, and the next, she was here, lost in the woods. She tried to move, to call out, but no sound came. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked. And then she saw it. The shadow. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, its form towering over her. The dark figure seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the air around it warping and bending. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, the same black voids that had haunted her in her living room. It didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. It moved toward her, and as it did, the world around her began to shift. The trees warped and twisted, their branches stretching toward the sky like reaching fingers. The ground cracked open, and Emma could feel the earth beneath her feet shifting, as if something ancient was awakening. The figure didn't stop. It kept coming, closer and closer, until it was standing right in front of her. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. It was as if the very air had turned to stone. "You belong to me." Emma tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The shadows around her thickened, closing in, suffocating her. The figure reached out, its long, bony fingers wrapping around her wrist with unnatural strength. "You will stay here, with me." In a final, desperate attempt, Emma reached out, her fingers brushing the ground, and found something. A small stone, jagged and cold. With all the strength she had left, she hurled the stone at the figure, but it didn't make a sound when it hit. It simply vanished into the air, as if the darkness had swallowed it whole. The figure recoiled, its form beginning to distort and fade. For a moment, Emma thought she had won, until it returned, larger and more grotesque, a shape that defied all logic. It reached for her again. And this time, she couldn't escape. In the days that followed, no one in Carver's Hollow spoke of Emma. Her house stood empty, but the whispers didn't stop. People in town would tell stories of the woman who had vanished, but no one truly understood what had happened. But those who lived close to the woods knew the truth. Late at night, they could hear the whispers of something that didn't belong, something that had been trapped for too long, something that now roamed the forest, waiting for its next victim. The house at the end of Willow Street. The town of Millbrook had always been quiet, tucked away in the hills, where the mist clung to the earth and the trees loomed like silent watchers. But that quiet wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that hung heavy in the air, as if it were waiting for something dark and forgotten. The town's history was full of empty houses, strange disappearances, and whispered warnings. And at the far end of Willow Street, there was one house that no one ever talked about, the one at the edge of the forest. No one knew much about the house, not anymore. It had stood abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, the windows boarded up, the door long since rotted away. Local legends spoke of the house being cursed, of a tragedy that had occurred there years ago, but no one could ever agree on the details. Some said it was a murder, others whispered of dark rituals that had taken place inside its walls. Whatever the truth was, the house was left alone. That is, until Hannah moved to Millbrook. Hannah was young, in her late 20s, and newly hired at the town's only bookstore. She was an outsider, just passing through on her way to a new life. Her apartment was small, just above the bookstore, and she didn't mind the isolation. It suited her. She liked the quiet. And the house at the end of Willow Street was just another curiosity to her, something she would never think about again once she had passed it by. But one evening, as she walked home from work, she couldn't help but glance down the street. The house at the end of Willow Street stood there, dark and hulking, just beyond the trees. The windows were shattered, and the roof had begun to cave in, but there was something about it that drew her in. It wasn't the decay or the mystery, it was the way it seemed to beckon her, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice it. She turned away quickly, trying to dismiss the thought, but it lingered. And over the next few days, she couldn't stop thinking about it. One afternoon, as Hannah passed by the house again, she saw something strange. The front door, which had been missing for as long as she could remember, was now slightly ajar. No one had been there. She would have noticed. But the door was open, as if someone had been there and left in a hurry. Curiosity gnawed her, and before she knew it, her feet were carrying her toward the house. She stepped onto the overgrown yard, the dry grass crunching beneath her boots. Her hand hovered over the door, unsure. She could hear the faintest sound coming from within, something like whispering, like a distant voice calling her name. Hannah. The voice was faint, almost like it was carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. She hesitated for a moment, heart racing, but then the pull of something darker took over. She pushed the door open. The inside of the house was colder than she had imagined. The air smelled of mildew and dust, and the light from the overcast sky filtered in through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting strange shadows on the walls. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and every step she took felt like it echoed through the empty house. The whispers grew louder. "Come closer." She turned the corner into the main hallway, her breath shallow. She couldn't stop herself from moving forward, despite every rational part of her mind screaming to turn around. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, but there was something underneath, something like symbols, drawn hastily, as though someone had tried to erase them but couldn't quite manage. She bent closer to examine one, but the moment her fingers brushed the wall, a cold shock ran through her, and she pulled back. The whispers were now clear, a chorus of voices, all saying her name. "Hannah, come closer." She was in the living room now, the floor strewn with old furniture that had been covered with sheets, as if someone had left in a hurry. There was an old, rickety rocking chair by the fireplace, gently swaying back and forth. Her eyes fell on the hearth, where a fire had once burned, but now only ashes remained. But the shadows in the room, they moved. Hannah. She took a step back, but the door slammed shut behind her, the sound of the wood hitting the frame like a thunderclap. Panic surged through her chest, but before she could react, the whispers turned into laughter. It was deep, guttural, a sound that made her skin crawl. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows in the corners stretching, twisting, like they had a life of their own. Hannah tried to scream, but no sound came from her lips. Her legs wouldn't move, as though the very floor beneath her feet had turned to quicksand. And then she saw it. From the corner of the room, a figure emerged. At first, it was nothing more than a dark shape, a silhouette against the wall. But as it moved closer, it became more defined, a tall, thin figure, draped in tattered rags, its face hidden in shadow. Its eyes, however, gleamed, a pale, almost translucent white, like they were made of glass. It was tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching toward her like spider legs. Its skin was ashen, mottled, like it had been scorched by something terrible. The mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. The creature's breath was like the sound of air rushing through a hollow pipe, cold and impossible to ignore. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was rasping, ancient, as if it had been waiting for centuries to speak. The figure's arms stretched out, its fingers curled like claws. "Now you're mine." Hannah's breath hitched in her throat as the figure lunged toward her. She scrambled backward, but her body felt frozen, paralyzed by terror. The shadows seemed to close in on her, pulling her into the corner, tightening their grip until she could barely breathe. She tried to fight it, tried to scream, but it was no use. The creature's cold hand grasped her wrist, and she felt the weight of its touch seep into her very bones. It was then that she understood. The house didn't want her to leave. It never had. The house was alive in ways she couldn't comprehend. It fed on fear, on memories, on people who were foolish enough to enter. The creature, whatever it was, had been waiting, patient, for someone to open the door. And now, it had her. But as the creature's grip tightened, as the darkness closed in on her, a voice, faint and distant, reached her ears. "You're not alone." For a moment, the shadows seemed to recede, and Hannah was able to take a shallow breath. The creature recoiled, its eyes flashing with fury, but the voice echoed again, louder this time. "Leave her alone." And just like that, the creature faltered. The shadows pulled back, and the room grew still. The figure screamed, loud, shrill, and desperate, and with a deafening crash, it vanished, disappearing into the very walls of the house. Hannah stumbled backward, her legs giving way beneath her. She couldn't understand what had just happened, but the darkness had receded. The whispers were gone. When she finally managed to pull herself to her feet, she was no longer alone. A woman stood in the doorway. She was tall, her dark hair flowing like a veil around her shoulders. Her skin was pale, and her eyes, though soft, held an intensity that made Hannah shiver. "You're not the first," the woman said, her voice low, but full of understanding. "And you won't be the last." Hannah could barely form words, but the woman spoke again. "The house, it's a prison. For both of us." The next morning, the house was quiet once again, abandoned as it had always been. The door was closed, the shadows had receded, and the whispers had gone. But Hannah knew better. The house at the end of Willow Street wasn't just a house. It was a tomb, and it would never let anyone leave. And as she stood there, watching the door from the safety of the street, she understood the curse. The house had fed on her fear. And now, it would wait for the next one. The Forgotten Visitor. Sarah had never been superstitious, but something about the old house she had inherited from her aunt felt wrong. It wasn't the grand, historic mansion that people might imagine when they think of inheritance. It was a modest, two-story home nestled in the hills of a forgotten town. The kind of place you'd never expect to find in a postcard, or even in a storybook. Sarah had always known about the house. Her aunt had spoken about it in hushed tones, saying how it had been in the family for generations. But Aunt Alice had been an eccentric woman, a recluse who kept to herself, so when she passed away, Sarah hadn't thought much about the house. She wasn't even sure why she'd agreed to take it. Maybe it was because she needed a fresh start, or maybe because the house had a strange pull on her. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it, a presence. Not an overwhelming feeling, but something subtle. A slight unease, like the air itself was watching her. The house had an odd smell, a mixture of dust and something older, like rot, although nothing appeared decayed. The walls were lined with old portraits, faces she didn't recognize. There was something unsettling about the eyes in those portraits, as if they were following her wherever she went. Sarah tried to shake off the feeling. It was an old house. Of course, it would feel strange. And it didn't help that she had to spend the night there. It wasn't exactly in the best shape, and she hadn't planned on staying long, just long enough to sort through Aunt Alice's things. The first night, she simply explored the house, taking inventory of the rooms, the hidden crevices, and the items that had been left behind. The house was full of old furniture, antiques, and books on subjects Sarah had never heard of, books filled with strange symbols and diagrams that looked more like the kind of thing you'd find in a forbidden library than in a dusty attic. She had no intention of spending the night. But as the evening came, she felt a deep sense of loneliness settle in. The town was far enough from any real civilization that there were no neighbors to visit, no cafes or restaurants nearby. The isolation started to settle over her, pressing in like the walls were closing in. By the time the sun began to set, Sarah had finished exploring the downstairs. She'd gone through the kitchen, the dining room, the library, and even the small study where her aunt had spent her time. The upstairs was where the real mystery seemed to lie. Sarah had been avoiding it, something about the quiet, dark staircase that seemed to beckon her. That night, after an unsettling dinner of whatever she could find in the fridge, she decided to brave it. The first thing that struck her was how cold it was up there, even though the rest of the house was warm. The air felt almost damp, but it was a dry cold, one that crept under her skin. The upstairs was long and narrow. 2 doors on either side of the hallway led to bedrooms, and at the very end of the hall was another door, an attic door. She approached the first door on the left and opened it. It was a child's room, filled with old, faded toys. A dollhouse stood in the corner, its windows cracked and chipped. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in dust, the once vibrant patterns now faded and lifeless. But it was the crib that caught her attention. It wasn't in the center of the room like it should have been. It was pushed up against the wall, the mattress sagging in the middle, as though it had been there for years, untouched. She stepped back, shaking her head. This was ridiculous. She wasn't a child anymore. She didn't need to be scared of an old room. She closed the door gently and turned toward the next room. But as soon as she touched the handle, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't explain it, but something inside her told her to open the door. She did. The room was identical to the first, but there was a difference. The walls were lined with photographs, thousands of photographs, all of the same person. Her Aunt, Alice. But the faces were different. In one, Alice looked young, like she was in her 20s. In another, she was older, her hair graying. But all the photographs had the same haunting quality to them, the eyes. They were all staring directly at Sarah, as if they knew she was there, watching her every move. She stepped back, heart pounding in her chest. The air felt thicker now, suffocating almost. She needed to get out. As she turned to leave, her foot caught on something on the floor. She looked down and froze. It was a small, old-fashioned music box, intricately carved with delicate patterns. It was open, and as Sarah reached down to pick it up, the lid slammed shut on its own. Her breath caught in her throat. It had been shut too hard to be a draft. Something was in the room with her. She rushed out, closing the door behind her, but not before catching one last glimpse of the corner of the room where she thought she had seen something move. A shadow? No, it couldn't have been. Shaken, Sarah went back downstairs. She sat in the living room, trying to steady her breathing. It wasn't until much later that night, after she had convinced herself it was all in her head, that she heard the sound. It was faint at first, just a whisper, like the wind had caught something in the house. But then it grew louder, more distinct. Sarah. Her name echoed through the house, the voice deep, unsettling, as if it came from the very walls themselves. She bolted upright, panic flooding her chest. The voice seemed to be coming from upstairs. Sarah, come upstairs. She tried to ignore it, but it was as though the voice was inside her head. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a force calling her, demanding her attention. With trembling legs, she got up and slowly ascended the stairs, drawn by the voice, unable to stop herself. At the top of the stairs, she turned toward the attic door. It was slightly ajar, and the shadows seemed to stretch beneath it like a deep void. Her feet carried her forward. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The attic was much larger than she had expected. It was filled with stacks of boxes, old furniture, and a thick layer of dust. And in the center of the room was a large, wooden chest. It was strange, too large, too imposing for a house like this. It had been there, waiting for her. As she moved closer, the whispers grew louder. It's inside. She opened the chest. Inside, there was nothing but a doll. A single, old porcelain doll with black, soulless eyes. She reached for it, and as her fingers brushed its cold skin, the whispers stopped. The attic door slammed shut behind her. Trapped. She turned around, but the room wasn't the same. It was as if the walls had closed in, the corners twisting into shapes that didn't belong. The doll's eyes glowed in the dark, staring at her. And from the shadows, something began to move. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was alive. It had been waiting for her. The ticking hourglass. Megan had always been a curious person. She'd always asked questions no one else dared to ask, and when her aunt passed away unexpectedly, Megan couldn't resist the pull to visit her house. Her aunt had always been a bit of a mystery, a quiet woman with strange habits, one who never quite fit in with the rest of the family. The house she had lived in, nestled at the edge of town, had always intrigued Megan. She'd never been allowed to visit as a child, and now, after her aunt's death, she finally had the chance to step inside and see what had been hidden away all these years. The house was everything Megan had expected. It was old, with creaky floorboards and an eerie quiet that filled the air. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the heavy curtains blocked out the sunlight, casting the rooms in a perpetual twilight. The furniture was antique, old and worn, but it wasn't the decor that caught Megan's attention. It was the atmosphere. The house felt heavy, as though it had been built on secrets, secrets that had been buried deep within the walls. Megan spent the first few hours exploring. She walked through the living room, the study, the kitchen, and the bedrooms, all of them untouched by time, as though her aunt had never left. But then, something caught her eye. In the corner of the hallway, near the staircase, was an old grandfather clock. It was beautiful, its wood polished to a deep, rich shine, and the face of the clock was intricate, with delicate gold hands that ticked away in an almost hypnotic rhythm. But there was something odd about the clock. The ticking wasn't normal. It sounded wrong, like it was too slow, too deliberate, as though each tick held some terrible secret. Megan moved closer to it, her hand instinctively reaching out to touch the cold wood. That's when she saw it. Just beneath the clock, on a small table, was an hourglass. The sand inside was moving, but it wasn't like any hourglass she'd ever seen. The sand didn't fall naturally from one end to the other. It moved in strange, jerky bursts, like it was being controlled by something. And the sand wasn't just ordinary sand, it was black, like coal, and it shimmered with a strange, unnatural glow. She stood there, staring at it, unsure of what she was seeing. The hourglass seemed to call to her, as though it was waiting for her to do something. But before she could move, the air in the room grew cold, and the ticking of the clock grew louder. The room seemed to close in on her, and she could feel her pulse quicken. Suddenly, the hourglass began to shake, the sand inside swirling violently, as if something beneath the surface was trying to break free. Megan backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she turned to leave, she heard a voice, a soft whisper, barely audible over the ticking of the clock. "It's time." She froze. The voice wasn't hers. It wasn't anyone's she knew. It was distant, hollow, and full of despair. The sand in the hourglass continued to swirl, faster now, and the ticking of the clock seemed to sync with her racing heartbeat. Megan turned back toward the clock and the hourglass, unable to tear her eyes away. The sand seemed to pulse, almost alive. And then, without warning, the hourglass shattered, sending black sand spilling across the table. The room went silent. For a moment, everything was still. And then, the air shifted. Something moved behind her. Megan whipped around, but no one was there. The room seemed darker now, the shadows stretching further than they should have. The ticking of the clock grew faster, like a countdown. The whispers began again, but this time, they were louder, closer. "It's time, come closer." Her body froze, the words crawling under her skin. The shadows in the room seemed to grow, twisting and bending, as though they were alive. And from the darkness, something began to emerge, an outline, faint at first, but then becoming clearer. It was a figure. Tall, thin, draped in shadows, its face hidden beneath the darkness. Megan's heart raced as the figure took another step forward, its footsteps silent but heavy, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. She couldn't move. Her legs were locked, her breath shallow. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, she felt a coldness seep into her bones. The temperature in the room dropped, the shadows wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. She could see the outline of the figure now, but its face was a blur, like something was distorting it, twisting it beyond recognition. And then, the voice came again, this time from the figure's mouth. "You opened the door." Megan could feel the words like a punch to the stomach. Her vision blurred, and she felt a sharp, cold pain spread through her chest. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The shadows wrapped around her, pulling her toward the figure. The clock's ticking grew louder, faster, until it felt like it was inside her head, drowning out everything else. "You opened the door. Now you must stay." With that, the figure reached out, its hand long and skeletal, its fingers cold and sharp. Megan felt the grip around her tighten, and she was pulled into the figure's embrace. The shadows consumed her, swallowing her whole. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the ticking of the clock. When the police arrived days later, they found the house abandoned. The clock was still ticking, the hourglass had shattered, and the sand, black and shimmering, covered the floor. But there was no sign of Megan. Her aunt's house remained empty, as it had been for years, but the house was no longer the same. It had changed. And in the distance, the faint sound of ticking could still be heard, growing louder as the days passed.